There is a unique power in a justice that arrives with a velvet touch and a perfectly steady hand at the end. Witness the smooth, calculated paths of those who finally found their peace after a lifetime of struggle. Hit subscribe now and see the price of truth.
My son-in-law looked me dead in the eye across my own kitchen table and said it like he was announcing the weather. His parents were moving into my house. Not a question, not a request. A statement of fact, delivered with the calm confidence of a man who had already decided the outcome before the conversation began. I kept my face neutral and poured myself more coffee. That was a Thursday evening in late September. My daughter Claire had cooked dinner at my place, which she did occasionally since I'd retired and moved into the house I'd spent 3 years renovating. A craftsman bungalow in Asheville, North Carolina. 4 bedrooms, wraparound porch. Every surface in that house I'd either restored myself or touched with my own hands. I knew every board, every nail, every square foot of it. My son-in-law Brandon set down his fork. His parents, Frank and Diane, were struggling, he explained. Rent had gone up. Frank's knee surgery had drained their savings. They needed somewhere stable while they got back on their feet. I had 4 bedrooms. Claire and Brandon lived in a 2-bedroom apartment across town. The math in his mind was obvious. Claire watched me from across the table with that careful expression I'd learned to read over 34 years of raising her alone after her mother passed. She wasn't surprised by what Brandon had said. She'd known this was coming. I asked a simple question. "How long?" Brandon waved his hand. 6 months. Maybe 8. Just until Dad's knee was fully healed and they could find something affordable. I nodded slowly, the way I nod when I'm measuring something, deciding where the cut needs to go. "That's a big ask," I said. "It's family," Brandon said, and the word came out smooth and practiced, like he'd rehearsed it. I told them I'd think about it. Brandon smiled. Claire looked relieved. They helped me with the dishes and drove home, and I stood at my kitchen window watching their taillights fade down the street. I wasn't going to think about it. I'd already decided. But I'd spent 31 years in a trade where you learn that the most important thing isn't the decision. It's the preparation before you act on it. I called my old friend Raymond the next morning. We'd worked together for 15 years before he pivoted into real estate law. I hadn't needed a lawyer in a decade, but I knew exactly where to find one. He picked up on the second ring and laughed when he heard my voice. I told him I needed advice. He told me to come by his office Monday. The weekend I spent documenting. Not from paranoia, but from habit. A contractor who doesn't keep records loses disputes, loses payments, loses everything. I wrote down the exact words Brandon had used at dinner. The date, the time, who was present, the precise phrasing. Then I pulled out my notebook and started a new section. Raymond's office Monday morning smelled like old coffee and case files. He listened without interrupting, which is why I've always respected him. When I finished, he leaned back and asked one question. Had I given them any indication I was agreeing? I said I'd told them I'd think about it. He nodded. Then he explained the same thing I'd later learned by heart. 30 days of occupancy, even without a lease, even uninvited, created residency rights in North Carolina. Eviction after that point could take months and thousands of dollars. The solution wasn't to argue or negotiate. The solution was to prevent entry entirely. He drafted a formal notice of no trespass while I sat across from him. We scheduled a civil standby with the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office for the following Saturday. Brandon had said they'd be arriving with a truck on Saturday afternoon. He'd been that specific, that confident. Raymond looked up from his notepad. "Do you think he'll push back hard?" I thought about the way Brandon had said the word family, the way he'd smiled when I said I'd think about it, like he already knew the answer. "Yes," I said, "he'll push back hard." "Then document everything from here forward," Raymond said. "Every call, every text, every voicemail. Keep it all." I drove home and installed a security camera system that afternoon. 4 cameras covering the front porch, the driveway, both side gates. I'd wired plenty of systems for clients over the years. This took me less than 3 hours. Claire called Wednesday evening. Her voice was bright in the way it gets when she's carrying something heavy underneath. She said she was just checking in, that she was so glad I was open to helping, that Frank and Diane were so grateful. She mentioned she was thinking of coming by Sunday to help them get settled in one of the spare rooms. I kept my voice even. I told her I'd see her Saturday. She laughed and said, "Of course, Saturday." And we'd hung up before I let myself feel the weight of it. My daughter had assumed compliance. She hadn't asked. She'd assumed. I confirmed the sheriff's standby Thursday morning. 2 deputies, civil matter. 2:00 p. Monsieur. I reviewed Raymond's paperwork twice that evening and once more Friday night. I practiced what I would say, stripped of anger, stripped of emotion. Just facts, just boundaries, just the law. Saturday I woke at 6, showered, dressed in clean jeans and a button-down shirt the way I'd dress for a job walkthrough with a new client. I ate breakfast. I reviewed my documents one last time and set them in a folder on the kitchen counter. By 1:30 I walked outside, and the 2 deputies pulled up 7 minutes later. The older one introduced himself as Deputy Garrett. Solid handshake, no-nonsense manner. He reviewed the no trespass notice and nodded. We talked through the likely scenario. I do the talking. They stand back unless things escalate. At 10 minutes past 2, I heard the truck before I saw it. A rental moving truck. White, diesel engine loud on the quiet street. Behind it, Brandon's black pickup. They pulled to the curb in front of my house. Through the front gate I watched Brandon climb out first, already wearing the expression of a man arriving to claim something that belonged to him. Then he saw me standing at the gate. Then he saw the deputies. His stride slowed. He stopped at the end of the driveway. "What is this?" He looked at the deputies, then at me. "What are you doing, Walt?" I handed Deputy Garrett the envelope. He walked forward and extended it. "This is a notice of no trespass," I said. "You're not coming onto this property today." Brandon stared at the envelope like it was a foreign object. He didn't take it at first. Then he snatched it with 2 fingers and held it at his side without opening it. The passenger door of the pickup opened. Claire stepped out. She was wearing sunglasses, but I could see the tension in her jaw from 20 feet away. Behind the truck, the passenger door opened. Frank came around the front of the vehicle, moving carefully on his recovering knee. Diane followed, looking confused, holding a small fabric bag to her chest like it might be taken from her. "Dad," Claire's voice carried across the driveway. "What's going on?" I turned to look at my daughter. I kept my voice level and clear. "Sweetheart, I never agreed to this. Your husband didn't ask me. He told me. When I said I needed to think about it, he took that as a yes. I've spent the last week making sure this doesn't happen." "That's not," Brandon started. "You said you'd think about it." "Thinking about it isn't a yes," I said. "And even if I'd said yes at that dinner table, I have the right to change my answer. This is my house. I decide who lives here." Brandon's jaw tightened. He looked at Deputy Garrett. "Can he do this?" "Sir," Deputy Garrett said in the practiced tone of someone who has explained this many times before, "this is private property. The owner has the legal right to deny access. That notice in your hand makes it official. You need to stay off the property." "We drove here from Knoxville," Diane said. Her voice was thin and high, carrying the particular tremor of someone who expected sympathy to change outcomes. "We had nowhere else to go." I looked at Diane directly. "I understand that's a difficult situation, but that arrangement was made without my consent. I'm not the reason you're in this position. You're turning away family," Brandon said. His voice had dropped to something harder. "You're turning away elderly people who need help. Your parents are not my family by obligation," I said. "And even if they were, that wouldn't give you the right to move them into my home without my permission." The moving truck driver leaned out his window. He looked bored and mildly annoyed. "Hey," he called. "You want me to wait or what?" Brandon turned toward him, then back to me. His hands were opening and closing at his sides. "I want to speak with you privately," he said. "Just us. 5 minutes." Deputy Garrett shook his head slightly. I echoed it. There's nothing to discuss privately that can't be said here, I told Brandon. He took a step toward the gate. The deputies moved forward almost imperceptibly, the way professionals do when they want to communicate presence without escalation. Brandon stopped. For a moment, I watched him recalculate. Claire had crossed the driveway and was standing closer now. She'd taken off her sunglasses. Her eyes were wet. Dad, she said quietly, they need help. Can't we work something out? The words landed the way they were designed to land, in the part of a parent that never fully hardens. But I'd thought about this moment specifically. In my workshop the night before, the way I think through a difficult joint before committing the cut. Claire, I said gently, I love you. But your husband made a decision that wasn't his to make. You supported it without calling to check with me. You were planning which room to put them in before you knew what I thought. That's not working something out. That's assuming I had no say. She looked at the driveway. Brandon was staring at me with an expression that had moved past frustration into something calculating. This isn't over, he said finally. The moving truck driver called out again. Made another job in 2 hours. Brandon looked at his parents. Frank had sat down on the bumper of the truck, quietly, saying nothing. There was something in the old man's posture, a slumped resignation, that made me wonder how much of this had been his idea and how much had been his son's. Come on, Brandon said to his parents. His voice was clipped. He was already building a story in his head. I could tell. Already reframing what had just happened into something he could use. Diane stood in the street looking at my house for a long moment. Then she looked at me. You'll regret this, she said. Deputy Garrett cleared his throat. Ma'am, it's time to go. They loaded back into the pickup. The moving truck pulled a 3-point turn. Brandon reversed out without looking back. Claire stood in my driveway a moment longer. She looked at me once, a look I couldn't fully read, and then she got in her car and followed them. Deputy Garrett turned to me. Clean as it gets, he said. You handled that well. I thanked him. Thanked his partner. Shook their hands. Watched the cruiser pull away. Then I stood alone in my driveway, in the October afternoon air, and looked at my house. The wraparound porch I'd rebuilt by hand. The porch swing I'd hung on a Saturday morning 3 autumns ago, just because I wanted to watch the sun come up from a good chair. Mine. The first call came at 6 that evening. Brandon. I let it go to voicemail and listened afterward. His voice was cold and tight. He talked for 4 minutes. The highlights were that I had humiliated his family in front of neighbors, that I had chosen property over people, that I would see very clearly who my real family was when I needed something. He used the word cruel 3 times. I saved it. Opened a new folder on my phone labeled documentation, logged the call with a timestamp. Over the following 2 weeks, 31 more calls came in. I answered none of them. I logged all of them. Brandon's messages escalated from cold to hostile to threatening. Twice he mentioned that I would regret my decision. Once he said I should think carefully about what I was protecting and whether it was worth what I was going to lose. Claire called 8 times. Her messages were different. Quieter. Confused. She wasn't defending what Brandon had done as openly now. She was asking me to call her back, just to talk. Just to explain what had happened from my side. I listened to each one. I wrote them down. I didn't call back. 3 weeks after the driveway incident, the certified mail arrived. I sliced it open at my kitchen table with the same letter opener I'd used for 30 years. I read it twice, then sat back and looked at the ceiling of the kitchen I'd retiled myself. The cabinets I'd built to specification, the window trim I'd sanded and stained on a cold November weekend 5 years ago. The lawsuit claimed intentional infliction of emotional distress and interference with family relations. It named Frank and Diane as the injured parties. It named Brandon and Claire as co-plaintiffs. My daughter's name on a lawsuit against me. I called Raymond. He was quiet while I read him the complaint. Then he exhaled. Nuisance suit, he said. Designed to pressure you into settling. It won't survive summary judgment, but we'll need to defend it properly. And Walt? All those voicemails? Every one of them, I said. Bring them Thursday. We met Thursday morning. I laid out my documentation folder the way I'd lay out a job estimate, organized, labeled, cross-referenced. Raymond went through it with reading glasses pushed up his nose, nodding occasionally. He's not a smart man, Raymond said finally, meaning Brandon. Smart people don't leave a trail like this. We spent 2 hours building our response. Raymond would file a motion for dismissal with prejudice and a counterclaim for harassment. North Carolina is a one-party consent state for recordings. Every voicemail was admissible. At home that evening, I sat in my workshop and thought about Frank. The way he'd sat on the truck bumper, quiet, not protesting, not demanding. I didn't know him well. Brandon and Claire had been married 3 years, and family dinners had always been tense enough that I'd never really had a conversation with the man. But I kept thinking about that slumped posture. I wondered how much he knew about what his son was doing. I wondered if he'd have chosen this himself. The hearing was set for January 14th. The weeks between had their own rhythm. Raymond requested financial records in discovery. Frank and Diane together received just under $51,000 annually between Social Security and Frank's disability payments. Brandon's income was documented at $68,000. The financial need claim dissolved on paper before we even got to court. One evening in December, I found myself in the workshop not building anything, just sitting at my bench. An old photo of Claire was pinned to the corkboard above the workbench, one I'd kept there for years. She was maybe 12, standing in the shell of a house I was framing for a client, wearing my hard hat, grinning like she'd built the whole thing herself. I used to bring her on job sites on school holidays. She'd learned to read a tape measure before most kids could read a clock. I looked at that photo for a while. Then I unpinned it, turned it face down on the bench, and went back inside to review my documents. January 14th was gray and cold. I dressed carefully, drove to the courthouse, and sat with Raymond in the hallway outside the courtroom while we waited. 30 minutes before the hearing, Brandon arrived with Claire and their attorney, a man in his 40s with a leather portfolio, and the expression of someone who knew the case was weak, but had to show up anyway. Brandon saw me and looked away. Claire looked at the floor. Inside, the courtroom was standard issue. Fluorescent lights, wood paneling, 15 rows of gallery seats mostly empty. The judge was a man in his late 60s, compact, with the particular patience of someone who has heard every variation of family disputes for 20 years. He reviewed the filings before the opening statements with the same expression I use when I'm looking at a contractor's estimate that doesn't add up. Their attorney argued that I had willfully deprived vulnerable elderly people of promised shelter, that my refusal had caused documented emotional harm, and that the relationship between the plaintiffs and myself constituted an obligation of care. He used the word family 4 times in his opening. He made it sound like a legal standard. Raymond stood. Your Honor, the word family is being asked to carry a great deal of weight this morning. Let's look at what actually happened. He laid it out methodically. I had never agreed to house Frank and Diane. I had said I would think about it, a phrase that carries no legal weight as consent. When I declined, I was told the move was happening regardless. He played 3 of the voicemails. Brandon's voice filled the courtroom, cold and specific. You should think about what happens to people who cut off family, Walt. People lose things. Things get damaged. I'm just saying. The judge's pen stopped moving. Raymond continued. He presented the financial documentation. He presented the incident report from the driveway with Deputy Garrett's signature. He presented the timeline of 31 calls over 14 days. Their attorney tried to redirect. The voicemails were taken out of context. Brandon was under stress. The family dynamic was complex. The judge looked up from the financial documents. Mr. Drake, he addressed Brandon directly. Does your attorney dispute the content of these voicemails? Brandon conferred with his attorney. Then, quietly, no. The judge reviewed the materials another 3 minutes in silence. Then he set them down with the finality of a man who has reached a conclusion. The claims of emotional distress and interference with family relations are dismissed. The plaintiff has failed to establish legal obligation or documented financial need. The defendant is awarded $2,800 in legal fees. The counterclaim for harassment is acknowledged and will be addressed in a separate proceeding. He looked at Brandon for a moment, longer than necessary. The defendant's decision to decline cohabitation is legally and morally his right. Courts do not exist to compel homeowners to open their doors to those who demand rather than request. The gavel. Outside, Raymond made notes. Brandon left without a word. Claire stood near the entrance, and as I walked past, she said my name. I stopped. She looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Something in her face was different from the courthouse scene I'd imagined. Not anger, not defense. Something closer to exhaustion and clarity arriving at the same time. I heard those voicemails played in there, she said. I'd never heard them. He told me he'd tried to reason with you, and you hung up every time. He didn't tell me. She stopped. He didn't tell me what he actually said. I kept my voice even. When did you hear them the first time? Just now. She looked down at the courthouse steps. He told me you agreed at dinner and then changed your mind to spite us. He said you'd always had a problem with him, and this was just an excuse. I thought about what to say and settled on the simplest version of the truth. I never agreed, Claire. And I don't have a problem with your husband. I have a problem with being told what will happen in my own home. She nodded slowly. I could see her adjusting something internal, the way you adjust the weight you're carrying when you realize you've had it wrong. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't tell her it was fine, because it wasn't. But I told her I'd hurt her, and I walked to my car. The drive home took 20 minutes. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and let the quiet of the house settle around me. The case had gone exactly as Raymond predicted. Brandon would likely receive a formal harassment finding from the separate proceeding. The legal fees would pinch him. Good. But none of that was what I was sitting with. I was sitting with my daughter's face when she said she'd heard those voicemails for the first time. 2 days later, a text from Claire. Short. Can we have coffee? Just us. No agenda. Please. I waited a full day before I responded. Then I said yes. We met at a diner on Marymount Avenue. She was already there when I arrived, both hands around a coffee mug, looking out the window. She looked like herself again, or maybe a version of herself I hadn't seen in a while. I sat down. She started talking before the server came. Not defending, not explaining, just accounting for herself. She said she'd spent the last 3 months telling herself that I was being rigid, that I was punishing Brandon for old conflicts, that my refusal was about pride instead of principle. She said she'd wanted that story to be true because the alternative was that she'd stood in my driveway and backed someone who was wrong. I listened. I've always been a better listener than talker. When she paused, I told her the truth plainly, that the hurt wasn't from Brandon's demands. I'd been dealing with difficult people my whole career. The hurt was from her, from standing next to a man who was threatening her father and choosing the easier position. She didn't argue. She said she knew. We talked for almost 2 hours about her marriage, which she said had been showing fractures long before the house situation, about the way Brandon's certainty about everything had felt like strength for a long time and had started feeling like something else, about the boys she and Brandon didn't have yet, which they'd been trying for, and the fights that had started around that subject. She didn't ask me to change my position. She didn't try to broker a peace with Brandon. She just sat across from me and was honest. Same time next week? She asked when we stood to leave. I said yes. That was in late January. Through February, I learned the shape of what was happening in Claire and Brandon's lives from the pieces she offered. Carefully. Not dumping. Just sharing. Frank and Diane had found a 2-bedroom apartment in Knoxville with rental assistance from a county program they'd qualified for. Frank's knee was improving. They were managing. Brandon's situation was different. The legal fees from the case sat unpaid. The separate harassment proceeding had resulted in a formal finding, no criminal charge but a civil record. He'd told people at his office a version of events in which I was the aggressor, and was surprised when the documentation circulated. In small professional circles, stories travel. One afternoon in February, he sent me a text through Claire's phone. He proposed what he called a fresh start, a mediated conversation, a chance to clear the air. I read it twice and didn't respond. He followed it with an email laying out a proposal for Frank and Diane to rent the upper rooms of my house at market rate. He called it a practical arrangement that could benefit everyone. I forwarded it to Raymond for the record and deleted it from my inbox. Claire told me later that month that she and Brandon were in couples counseling, that the counselor had asked Brandon to describe the events of the previous fall, and that listening to him describe them had been the moment she'd understood something clearly. He hadn't been able to tell the story in a way that gave me a fair account of what had happened. Every version made him the reasonable party who had been aggrieved. She filed for separation in March. I drove her to pick up papers from her attorney's office on a cold Wednesday morning. We didn't talk much on the way. On the way back, she said she was scared, and I said that was appropriate. And she laughed a little, which is the laugh she makes when something is true and not funny. The divorce proceedings took 4 months. Brandon contested the settlement, claimed Claire had been influenced by my interference, and called her decisions evidence of estrangement. Her attorney presented the court file from January, the voicemails, the civil harassment finding, the incident report from September. The judge at the family court hearing had a long career and a short tolerance for reframing. The record told the story without any help from any of us. Claire received primary custody of herself, her apartment, and her plans, which is not a legal category, but is the one that mattered. She got a good settlement on the shared assets. I didn't celebrate. I helped her move boxes into a new apartment on a Saturday in July. We built a bookshelf together that afternoon from a flat-pack kit, which took longer than either of us expected, and we argued mildly about the instructions, which was the most normal thing we'd done together in almost a year. When we finished, she sat on her new couch and looked around the apartment. "It's small," she said. "It's yours," I told her. She nodded. Yeah. By August, she'd settled into a rhythm. She'd gone back to the landscape architecture firm where she'd worked before Brandon had convinced her the commute was too long. She called twice a week. We had coffee most Sundays. She was building something. Slowly. Carefully. The way people build things when they're doing it right. One Sunday in September, almost exactly 1 year from that kitchen table dinner, she came over for the afternoon. We sat on the porch swing I'd hung 3 autumns ago and drank iced tea in the last of the summer heat, and watched the neighborhood go about its business. She asked me once, quietly, if I'd thought about forgiving Brandon. I told her I didn't have enough feeling about Brandon anymore to require forgiveness. What he'd done had been wrong, and consequences had followed, and that was the end of a chapter, not a wound I was tending. "What about me?" she asked. I looked at my daughter. She was 34 years old, sitting on a porch swing in September, asking her father a real question. I told her I'd forgiven her in February, over bad diner coffee, when she sat across from me and told the truth without rehearsing at first. She was quiet a minute. "I should have called you," she said. "That night, when Brandon first brought it up. I should have called you separately and asked what you actually wanted." "Yes," I said. "You should have." We sat with that for a while. A cardinal landed on the porch railing, looked at us, and left. "I'm learning that," she said finally. "The difference between keeping the peace and just keeping quiet. Those aren't the same thing," I agreed. She nodded. "I know that now. I've thought about what the past year was. At a distance, the way you look at a renovation once the dust has settled, and you can see the whole structure." Brandon had walked into my house and seen rooms. He'd seen square footage, spare capacity, a resource he could redirect. He hadn't seen what those rooms represented. The 31 years of early mornings and late bids and calloused hands and weekend jobs that had built toward the right to stand in my own house and decide for myself. You don't get to take that from a man. Not by demanding it, not by making it about family or obligation or what's fair given the size of the rooms. You especially don't get to take it when the man has kept records his whole life and knows exactly how to document a threat. Frank and Diane were fine. I'd heard through Claire that Frank had recovered well, that they'd settled into their apartment in Knoxville with some equanimity. I didn't know what Frank thought of all of it. I hoped he'd had some peace about his son eventually, even if it came slowly. The October evening that year was cool the way Asheville Octobers are. Clean and clear. Leaves just starting to turn. I sat on the porch swing with coffee after Claire had driven home and listened to the neighborhood settle into evening. My house was quiet. Every room exactly as I'd arranged it. The workshop out back where I still built things. Not for clients anymore, but for the pleasure of the work. Because some habits are too good to quit. The kitchen I'd retiled. The cabinets I'd made to my own specification. The porch swing I'd hung because I wanted a good chair to watch the sun come up from. A man spends his working life building things for other people. Houses, kitchens, cabinets, spaces where strangers will eat and sleep and argue and grow old. You build them well because your name is on the work. Because the craft matters. Because a thing worth doing is worth doing all the way. And somewhere in the middle of all those years, if you're careful and you save and you work the extra weekends, you build yourself a place that is entirely and only yours. I hadn't won some battle. I hadn't beaten anyone. I'd simply declined to hand over what I'd earned to someone who thought the asking was the same as the deserving. That's not a victory. That's just a minimum standard for a life. I finished my coffee. The first stars were showing above the ridgeline. Same time next Sunday, Claire had said from her car window before she left. Absolutely, I'd told her. I went inside, locked the door, checked the security cameras out of habit, and moved through the quiet rooms of my house, which was mine, which had always been mine, and which on this particular October evening felt exactly the size it was supposed to be.